Hello, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Natasha Garfield from the Denver Scholarship Foundation, and today we will be talking about Foundations of Financial Aid, Part 1, Preparing for the Application. Here are the performance objectives that we're going to be working towards today. So by the end of our time together, you will be able to support students to select the appropriate financial aid application, either FAFSA or CASFA. You will be able to determine what the student's expected dependency status is. You will support students to identify who their contributors will be for financial aid applications. You'll know how to assist students or contributors in creating a studentaid.gov account for the FAFSA, and you'll also be prepared to assist students to create their accounts for CASFA. A few things to note. One is that we will be referencing DSF's financial aid virtual binder throughout the session. These are materials that we call job aids that are intended to support you on the job that you can reference while you're working with students and families. There are 3 ways you can access this binder. If you are a DSF staff member, you can go to the Financial Aid Hub to click on the link. If you're not a DSF staff member or you don't have the Financial Aid Hub handy, you can use the tiny URL that you see on your screen, or you can scan the QR code. You'll also see throughout our slides today this little cat. We call this cat Jiggles, the job aid cat. When you see Jiggles on the slides, you will know that there is a job aid or a resource material available to you in the binder that supports the content that we're talking about. So as we begin, let's talk about what are FAFSA and CASFA. FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. This is the student aid application that is provided for in federal law, and it's used to determine whether a student is eligible for federal student aid programs like the Pell Grant and direct student loans. CASFA is the Colorado application for state financial aid. CASFA is for students who are not eligible for federal student aid, undocumented students, or students who come from a mixed status family or have another situation that leads them to prefer not to share their contributors' personal data with the federal government. And we're going to talk more about that later. It's important to note that when a student completes the FAFSA, they are applying for federal aid, state aid, and institutional aid. It will be used by their college to award aid at all 3 of those levels. Students who complete the CASFA, on the other hand, are applying for state aid and institutional aid only. CASFA results do not entitle a student to be considered for federal aid. Students who meet the requirements of a Colorado law called ASSET and complete the CASFA may receive state-funded financial aid. Typically, that's a Colorado state grant. Students who don't qualify under the ASSET law for state aid are still encouraged to complete the CASFA because it can be used to award them institutional aid depending on the college they attend. So the first step in preparing for the financial aid applications is going to be for the student to determine which application they should complete. It's important to note that students should be sure to complete only one application, CASFA or FAFSA, not both. And in fact, if they complete both, it can create some confusion and complications at their college. So it's important to encourage them to really evaluate which application is right for them before they get started. So for the FAFSA, in general, it is an application for students who are either U.S. citizens or eligible non-citizens. Eligible non-citizens include U.S. permanent resident. That means what we often refer to as a green card holder, or certain other immigration statuses, including refugee and asylum granted. If a student has a pending application for asylum or another form of an immigration status change, they will complete the CASFA, and they can always go back and apply for FAFSA once their status has been approved by USCIS. Students who will complete the CASFA are not US citizens in general. Typically, they may qualify as a Colorado asset student, which means they've attended a Colorado high school for at least a year before graduation or GED, and they've been physically present, that means living in Colorado, for 12 months before the start of their first college semester. Even if students don't meet those Colorado asset requirements, they should still complete the CASFA if they have financial need, because as I mentioned, they may be considered for aid from their institution, which we usually refer to as institutional aid. Keep in mind that the CASFA is used only by Colorado public institutions. CASFA completers who are applying to out-of-state colleges or private colleges in Colorado need to contact those colleges or check their websites to understand what type of financial aid application they should complete. There are a lot more details about which students will qualify for FAFSA, so we highly recommend that you use this job aid to help your students take a look at the lists and figure out which status is going to appropriately determine their aid application. So when you're having conversations with students to help them figure out which application to complete, first, we want to keep in mind that immigration status can be a very sensitive topic for some students and families. Please do your best to use inclusive language and show that you're here to support the student regardless of their status. No matter what their status is, there are options and different ways that they can approach paying for college. So we just always want to be really sensitive and supportive to encourage students to pursue their goals, even if their path might look a little bit different. One thing that you can do is use the job aid that we just looked at and have the student look over it to figure out which immigration status applies to them. Other questions that you can ask your student is, where were you born? The reason you would ask this is because students born in the US will generally be eligible for federal aid. There are only some very narrow exceptions where they wouldn't be. Students who were born in other countries may still be eligible for federal aid, so you'll need to ask some additional questions to explore what their current immigration status is. You can also ask if the student has a social security number or card. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how you can use that information to help figure out which application to complete. You can also ask the student, how long have you lived in Colorado? This question is helpful because it will help you to determine if they're going to qualify for in-state tuition and state financial aid through the asset program, as I mentioned. So often high schoolers do not know what their immigration status is. This is usually the time in their lives when they're starting to understand these concepts and learn more from their families about their status. So they may not know if they're a US citizen, a legal permanent resident, or fall into one of the other categories of eligible non-citizen. So that's why asking if they have a social security number can help to answer the question of whether they're eligible for federal aid. Students who do not have a social security number are generally not going to be eligible for federal aid. So typically, if they don't have an SSN, they will be completing the CASFA. There are some small exceptions where a student may have recently received a green card or been approved as a refugee or asylee, but they just haven't received their social security card yet. But that is something that we're not going to spend a lot of time on today. So If the student says they have a social security number, but they feel unsure about their status, you could ask them to take a look at the card. If the card says valid for work only, generally that means they are not going to be eligible for federal aid and they should complete the CASFA. If they show you their social security card and there are no restrictions on the card, generally that means that they are going to be eligible for federal aid and they should complete the FAFSA. Next up, we have another job aid that will help you with interpreting student status. This is what we call eligible non-citizens, examples of immigration documentation. These are images of various types of USCIS documents that you can show to your student, and hopefully it will help them to recognize what type of document they have, even if they don't have them with them as you're talking. One thing I just want to note about making the decision of which application the student should complete is please encourage students to take their time and really understand their status before deciding on the application. It's much better to maybe talk to the family, ask some questions, feel confident that the student really has identified which application is right for them before moving forward with the rest of the process. Now we're going to move on to step 2, which is understanding the student's dependency status. The reason that dependency matters for purposes of FAFSA and CASFA is that this tells you whether the student is going to be required to provide parent information. Most high school and undergraduate students will be required to provide parent information because they are considered dependent. Students who are independent generally will have a personal circumstance that we'll go into more in a moment. That means they don't have to provide parent information on their financial aid application. It's really important to note here that a lot of folks are familiar with the concept of dependency when it comes to filing taxes. But the FAFSA meaning of dependency is different than the IRS meaning of dependency. So it's really important that families understand that it doesn't matter whether they provide financial support for the student or whether they claim the student on their taxes. If the student is under age 24 and unmarried and has not received a bachelor's degree, then in most cases, they will still need to provide parent information. The determination of whether a student is dependent or independent means that it could impact how much financial aid the student is offered. If they are dependent, the application is going to take into account both the student and the parent's income and assets. If the student is independent, the application will only account for the student's information, assets and income, and the student's spouse if they're married. Dependency status will be determined based on the student responding to a list of personal circumstance questions. If the student answers yes to any of those questions, which we'll look at in just a moment, they will be considered independent for federal student aid purposes. And that means they will not provide parent information on their FAFSA. Again, most students who are under age 24 and unmarried will be considered dependent, and they will need to provide parent information on their FAFSA or CASFA. Even if their parent does not financially support them, even if their parent does not claim them on taxes, and even if their parent is not planning to provide financial support for their college education. So here is the list of personal circumstances questions. The student will see these in a slightly different form when they're actually completing the FAFSA and CASFA. They may not see all of the questions at once on a single screen. And they will be checking a box to indicate that, yes, that circumstance applies to them, if it does. For most 12th graders, they are going to choose none of these apply to me, but it's important that they review the list carefully and ask questions if they're not sure what any of the terms mean. Once you have determined if the student will be considered dependent or independent, then the next step is figuring out who will be contributors on the FAFSA or CASFA. A contributor is anyone who is required to provide information on the financial aid application, consents to release their federal tax information to federal student aid if completing the FAFSA, or shares details about their finances and income if completing the CASFA. The student is always going to be a contributor to their FAFSA or CASFA. Other possible contributors include the student's parents, step-parent if married to the student's parent, and the student's spouse. We're going to say this several times today, but that's because folks do tend to get quite confused about it. A student's legal guardian, so not their parent, but another legal guardian appointed by a court, is not going to be a contributor unless they have legally adopted the student. And it doesn't matter if that legal guardian provides full financial support for the student, even if the legal guardian plans to pay for them to go to college, the student will still be considered independent because they are in a court-ordered legal guardianship, and they will not include information from their legal guardian on their application. A few definitions here. Parent, as it's used in FAFSA and CASFA, includes a biological parent, an adoptive parent, and a step-parent if currently married to a biological or adoptive parent. The term parent never includes grandparents, siblings, or other relatives, even if they provide care and financial support for the student. Parent does not include legal guardians, and parent does not include foster parents or family friends, again, even if they are acting like a parent and providing care and support for the student. For all of these folks, again, unless they have legally adopted the student, they are not going to be considered a parent for purposes of FAFSA or CASFA. We have two job aids that can help students to figure out who will be the contributors on their application, and we're going to talk about each of them in a little bit more detail. The first one is this flow chart that can help you walk through the conversation of deciding who the contributors will be. The first question is, are your parents married to each other? From there, you will ask, do your parents live together? Because if parents are unmarried but living together in the same household, both parents will be included on the FAFSA. If the parents do not live together, or if one of the parents is not in the picture, then you're going to ask which parent provided more financial support in the last 12 months. Once you've identified that parent, then you'll ask, is this parent remarried? And basically, as you answer each of those yes or no questions, this infographic will help you determine which parent or parents will be included on the form. Sometimes parents who don't live together will insist that financial support over the past 12 months is exactly equal between the two parents. If they insist that that's the case, then you will use the parent who has higher income. Federal Student Aid also offers an electronic tool on their website called the Who is My Parent tool. You do not need a login to use this tool, and so that means that it can be used by anybody, including students who will be completing the CASFA. It walks through very similar questions to the infographic that we just looked at, but it just may be preferable for some folks to actually answer these questions and then have the tool identify for them who will be the contributors on the form. Next, let's take a look at the possible documents that contributors will need to help them with completing the financial aid applications. So first up, we highly recommend that folks bring their tax returns. There are times when we need the actual tax forms in order to answer questions on the FAFSA. So just planning to have them with the family makes the process go much easier. We do not expect you to be a tax expert. And in fact, we want to be very clear with the families we support that we are not tax experts. We can help them connect with tax resources if they have questions about filing taxes, and we can help them to interpret their forms to complete the application, but we can't give any advice about tax filing. Along with those tax returns, if it's possible to also bring the W-2s, that can be helpful if it's going to be necessary to separate the parents' income. If parents are required to file taxes, meaning they earned enough income that they are over the tax filing requirement threshold, then we really will encourage them to file as soon as possible. And that's because if they were required by the IRS to file and they haven't done it, the college is going to require them to file before they will award aid to the student. We do have a tax filing requirements job aid that we'll take a look at in just a moment. We also want all contributors to bring information about their assets. This would include any child support that they received in the last year. And for both students and parents, they will be asked for their current balance of cash, checking, and savings accounts. We also want contributors to be aware of any federal benefits that the family has received, like SNAP or Medicaid. Reporting these is important because it maximizes the student's aid eligibility, because the fact that they've already qualified for those federal benefits indicates that they have greater financial need, and they will then have a lower student aid index number. They don't need to know the amount of those benefits or the value of the benefits. They just need to know yes or no, which federal benefits did the family receive. And here is that job aid that I mentioned. This is the tax filing requirements chart for most taxpayers. So the family member, parent, or student can take a look, find their filing status category, their age range, and then the income threshold. If they earned over the income threshold for their category, then they were required to file taxes. We also, as I mentioned, have the tax help resources flyer, which is circled, the second circle that you'll see in yellow there on the screen. And that just lists organizations in the Denver area who provide free or reduced costs help to folks with their taxes. All right, now we're going to check for understanding about contributors. And we're going to do that by reflecting on some scenarios. So what we're going to do is take a look at the scenarios here, and then you can pause the video for just a moment so you can think through each of them, and then we will go over the results together. So turning to scenario A, Jose's parents are divorced. His mom remarried when Jose was 13. He lives with his mom and step-parent during the week and spends time with his dad on weekends. His mom pays for his cell phone bill and most other expenses. So in this case, Jose is living with mom and step-parent during the week, and mom is paying most expenses. So from that, we can conclude that it looks like mom is providing more financial support. That means that Jose's mom and step-parent will be the contributors. Remember that because mom is remarried, the step-parent's information will also be required for the FAFSA or CASFA, even though that step-parent may not provide any financial support. All right, moving on to scenario B. So for scenario B, Remy's biological parents never married, but they live together. In this situation, because both of these parents are his legal parents or their legal parents, it doesn't matter whether they are married to each other. What the question is here is, are they the legal parents, and do they live in the same household? And that's because what FAFSA is really interested in is, what is the family's financial strength? So in this situation, since they aren't married, it's unlikely that they filed taxes jointly, which means that most likely each of them is going to need to have their own FAFSA account, and each of them will need to provide their own income and asset information. However, if the parents did file taxes together, one parent will actually be the contributor on the form, but will provide information about both parents. Moving on to scenario C. Justice has lived with their aunt since they were 3, and their aunt is their legal guardian. They don't have contact with their biological parent. In this situation, because Justice's aunt is their legal guardian, Justice will be independent on the FAFSA or CASFA and will not provide parent information. Remember, Justice's aunt will not be a contributor because they are a legal guardian. They have not adopted Justice. Justice will need to provide proof of the legal guardianship. That's generally going to be in the form of a court order of legal guardianship to the financial aid office after their FAFSA has been processed and sent to the school. Okay, now we're going to move on to creating accounts. First, we're going to talk about creating accounts for the FAFSA. For the FAFSA, each contributor must create their own studentaid.gov account, which is also known as a Federal Student Aid ID or FSA ID. Any individual who already has an existing student aid account will continue to use the same account, and that is because it is tied to their personally identifying information, like their name, birth date, and specifically Social Security number. So even if a parent may have created their account years ago when they were in college, they are still going to use that same account. And this is the way that individuals electronically sign the FAFSA. In a situation where there is a two-parent household and they didn't file joint taxes, as I mentioned before, each parent is going to create their own account because their tax information will be pulled from the IRS individually. Each contributor is going to need several pieces of information in order to create their account. Their full legal name, that should be exactly as it appears either on their Social Security card, if they have one, or on another government-issued ID. Their date of birth, their Social Security number, which is required for students but not for other contributors, their email. A note here that students should not use their high school email because they are going to keep this account for any time that they're in college or grad school, and they will lose access to that high school email address once they graduate. They'll also need a mobile phone number. This is highly recommended, although it is not strictly required in order to create an account, and they will also need to provide their mailing address. It's important to note here that parents, parent spouses, or student spouses may be filing taxes with an individual taxpayer identification number or ITIN, and that's great. However, they will not, under any circumstances, use that ITIN to create a FSA account. If they don't have a social and they do have an ITIN, we'll talk about how they'll handle that next. Okay, so when a parent or a spouse is creating their account, they will come to a box for Social Security number, and underneath that box, they'll see a blue linked text that says, "What if I don't have a Social Security number?" They should click that link, and then they will see the text that you see here on the screen explaining which statement applies to them. So they then will need to check the box that says, I don't have a social security number. And this is really important that they check that box, even if they do use an ITIN for filing their taxes, because the federal student aid checks social security records to confirm identity if a social security number is provided, but ITINs actually come from the IRS, so it's a completely different system of IDs, and they aren't used in place of one another. And again, a note that if it's a two-parent household and they didn't file joint taxes, then each parent creates their own account, even if one has a social security number and one doesn't. So once they've provided all of that identifying information that we just went over, next up, each contributor will create a username and password. FSA does not allow them to use their name or date of birth as part of those usernames and passwords. And then they'll choose a two-step verification method. This is a system that we're all familiar with, where they'll receive a one-time code each time they go to log in to studentaid.gov. They can do email, they can do text, or they can do both. They also have the option to choose an authenticator app, but that is a little bit less common for folks, so we don't see that option being selected very often. We do recommend that each contributor chooses as many of those verification methods as they can, because the more options for getting logged in, the better, since self-service is sometimes kind of spotty in some of the schools we work in. For our contributors without social security numbers, they will also be asked to answer 4 identity verification questions. They tend to be things like, which of these addresses have you lived at? Which of these types of cars have you owned? Which of these phone numbers have you had? This is very similar to credit checks that you may be familiar with from banks and that kind of thing. Their credit is not being checked. It's just that they use a similar provider for the identity verification. And as soon as the contributor completes all of those steps, then they will be ready to start the FAFSA form. They don't need to log in again once they've created their account. And here we have a lovely new job aid. This is from Federal Student Aid, just released in the last couple of weeks, that walks through all of the steps that we've just been talking about, and is something that you can use with your students and families as they're creating their accounts. We have heard from FSA that this guide will also be available in Spanish, so we'll be sure to add it to the virtual binder as soon as it is available. Next, we're going to talk about step 4, which is creating CASFA accounts. So the most important thing to know about CASFA accounts is that only students will create an account for the CASFA. Parents do not create an account. When students are ready to get started, they can either go to the long URL that you see there on your screen, or they can just Google CASFA application. Once they get to the CASFA website, students will create their account with the following information. First, they need their full legal name. What's important here is that they need to use exactly the same version of their name on their CASFA and when they're applying to college. And the reason for that is that the colleges are going to use that name along with their date of birth to match their admissions application to their CASFA. And if there's a mismatch in those names, then it often can really delay the student receiving their financial aid offers. Students will also need their date of birth, their email, and their mobile phone number. And again, they should not use their high school email because it will be deactivated when they graduate. So they should be using a personal email like Gmail or Outlook or whatever they choose. CASFA also uses multi-factor authentication. So once the student fills out all of the information to create their account, they'll then receive an email asking them to verify their account, and they'll receive a verification code each time they go to log in to the CASFA. All right, so just a quick review here. Step one, when students and families are getting ready to apply for financial aid, will be to decide which application to complete, FAFSA or CASFA. Next, the student and family will determine what is the student's dependency status. Are they dependent, meaning they need parent information on their application, or independent, meaning it will only be the student and perhaps student spouse whose information is included. Then moving on to step three, the family will determine who will be the contributors on the application. And a reminder here that only the student, legal parents, either biological or adoptive, and the parent spouse will ever be included on the application. Step four then will be to create accounts for anyone who needs to contribute to the FAFSA. And if the student is completing CASFA, then the student will create an account. Thank you very much for watching this video today. Next up, we have Foundations of Financial Aid Part 2, where we will look at completing the FAFSA and CASFA applications.